Hello and welcome this morning to Walt Disney, an American original from written by Bob Thomas, narrated by Dear Disney Productions. We will be doing section 4, chapter 21. Here you go. Roy Disney flew to New York with his small burden, a 6-page explanation of his brother's vision, together with a diagrammatic map of Disneyland and a fold-out aerial conception drawn by Herb Ryman under Walt's direction. Roy began discussing with the 3 television networks and with potential sponsors for an hour-long weekly television show. Roy stipulated that whoever wanted the television show would have to invest in Disneyland. The Columbia Broadcasting System expressed little interest. General Foods saw the value of Disney to appeal to family consumers and offered a contract if Disney would make a pilot film. Walt had established his policy: we don't make samples. Both the National Broadcasting Company and the American Broadcasting Company had long sought a television series from Disney. NBC, with the huge resources of its parent company, Radio Corporation of America, seemed the best prospect, and Roy had lengthy talks with the firm's founder, General David Sarnoff. Each time, Sarnoff expressed his enthusiasm for a Disney series as well as the park, but each time he handed over the negotiations to underlings and Roy could get no commitment. After a long, frustrating meeting with RCA executives, Roy went back to his hotel and telephoned Leonard Goldenson, president of ABC. Leonard, a couple years ago, you expressed an interest in working out something with us in television. Roy said, are you still interested? Excuse me. Roy, where are you? Goldenson asked. Roy told him, and Golden said, I'll be right over. Goldenson and Roy Disney agreed that Disney would supply a 1-hour television series to ABC in return for a $500,000 investment in the Disneyland park. ABC would become a 35% owner of Disneyland and would guarantee loans up to $4.5 million. The arrangement was satisfactory for both parties. Disney received much needed cash and a credit line for the park. ABC, which had been unable to compete in ratings with the 2 older networks, would present a prestigious show which could improve its standing in the television marketplace. In early 1954, Disneyland Incorporated, which Walt had founded 3 years before, was reconstituted with Walt Disney Productions and American Broadcasting Company Paramount Theaters, each owning 34.48% with investments of $500,000 apiece. Western Printing and Lithographing, which had been associated with Disney in publishing comics and books since 1933, contributed $200,000 for a 13.79% interest. Walt Disney acquired 7.25% by investing $250,000 himself. The plans for the Disneyland Park and television show were announced April 2, 1954. To demonstrate the seriousness of his intentions, Walt declared the series would begin in October of 1954 and the parks would open in July of 1955. He assigned veteran Disney hands to production of the television show, which would be patterned after the realms of Disneyland, Adventureland, Fantasyland, Frontierland, etc. He moved the Disneyland Park unit into a first-floor wing of the animation building, and now the planning gave way to practicability. In July 1953, Walt had commissioned the Stanford Research Institute to make 2 surveys to find the ideal location for Disneyland and to determine Disneyland's economic feasibility. Walt had been offered a former police pistol range in Canoga Park in the northeast part of the San Fernando Valley. Stanford Research advised against it, reasoning that the San Fernando Valley was 15 degrees hotter in the summer than the coastal areas, and 10 degrees colder in the winter. Besides, visitors from cities to the south would have to travel across the Los Angeles urban sprawl to reach Canoga Park. Harrison Buzz Price, Los Angeles' director of the Stanford Research Institute, plotted the optimum location for Disneyland in terms of population centers and hotel room availability. The ideal was the railroad terminal in downtown Los Angeles, but that was obviously the wrong place to acquire reasonably priced land. The future growth of the freeway system was plotted. Freeways would soon be spreading into the San Fernando and Pomona valleys and south to Santa Ana. Those to Santa Monica and Long Beach would come later. Walt himself ruled out the location of Disneyland at the beach. He reasoned that the ocean would eliminate half the access to the park, creating a funnel effect. Besides, he had always disliked the honky-tonk atmosphere of amusement piers, and he didn't want people coming to Disneyland in bathing suits. Price and his researchers discovered that the center of population in Southern California was moving south and east. They continued their hunt in that direction, arriving at Anaheim as the ideal location. It would be easily reached by the Santa Ana Freeway, then under construction, and 20 sites of 150 acres or more were available. The best one, Stanford Research decided, was a 160-acre orange grove near the junction of the freeway and Harbor Boulevard. The selection was an accurate one. 18 years later, the center of population of the 8 Southern California counties would be in Fullerton, 4 miles away. Walt and Roy Disney were convinced. Negotiations began for purchase of Anaheim property. The feasibility survey by Stanford Research took more time. Researchers visited all the major amusement parks in the United States, as well as Tivoli Gardens and others in Europe. The American parks were found to be seasonal, unplanned, unimaginative attractions that appealed almost entirely to the local population, not tourists. The best research was accomplished at the San Diego Zoo, which had year-round attendance of 2 million. Thus, the pattern of month-by-month patronage could be plotted. Price and other Stanford researchers had a memorable encounter with the owners of amusement parks at their convention in Chicago in November of 1953. In a late-night session over whiskey and cigars, the park operators studied Walt Disney's concepts of a new kind of amusement park. The decision was unanimous. It wouldn't work. There was not enough ride capacity. Too much of the park didn't produce revenue. The newfangled rides would cost too much in maintenance. Mechanical failures in a year-round operation would be epidemic. The park owners advised Walt Disney to save his money. The results of the feasibility survey were encouraging to Walt. The figures were conservative, an estimate of 2.5 million to 3 million annual customers, with spending between $2.50 and $3 per person. Stanford Research accurately forecasted the seasonal variations in attendance based on San Diego Zoo figures and calculated the stick for the size of the park. On the basis of its finding, an initial investment of $11 million was recommended. The original plan for Disneyland was being altered. Lilliputian Land, with its tiny mechanical figures, was put aside. Walt wanted larger figures, and he needed time to develop new ways of making them move. The jungle ride was originally planned with live animals, but zookeepers advised that would be impractical. Animals would be asleep or hidden much of the time. We will need mechanical animals so that every boatload of people will see the same thing, Walt said. The idea of walk-through attractions was dropped. Amusement park owners cautioned that patrons had to be transported in vehicles or they'd bunch up and halt the flow of traffic. All park operators contended that Walt's concept of a single entrance was faulty. It would create congestion and make parking difficult. They argued. Walt remained firm. He reasoned that people became disoriented when they entered by different gates. He wanted everyone to be channeled in the same way, to have their visit to Disneyland structured as part of a total experience. He was also insistent on the idea of the hub that led to the various areas of interest. I'm tired of museums and fairs where you have to walk your legs off, he said. I don't want anybody at Disneyland to get museum feet. Throughout the planning, a familiar Disney word, weenie, was used. A weenie was a lure and an inducement, in the same way that an animal trainer used a frankfurter to evoke tricks from a dog act. In Disneyland, the castle served as the weenie to draw the people down Main Street. Then, when they reached the hub, 2 other weenies would attract them to the right or to the left. In Tomorrowland, it would be the towering rocket to the moon. In Frontierland, the Mark Twain steamboat. Walt observed that other amusement parks had grown by accretion, often starting with a hot dog stand and a merry-go-round, then adding features over the years with no design or pattern. World's fairs, although conceived during a single span of time, were poorly planned. They were clustered of individual, highly competitive exhibits. The result was fatigue for the visitor. Most fatiguing of all were museums, Walt concluded, even great ones like the Louvre and the British Museum. With his unique experience as a maker of animated films, Walt Disney brought to the amusement park an extraordinary sense of continuity. He saw the need for Disneyland to flow, as did a movie, from scene to scene. The transitions should be gentle, he realized, with architecture and colors complementing each other in the areas of change. Thus, the visitor would be led from one attraction to the next without the jolt of adjustment, and he would remember everything he saw. That was not true of the visitor to a World's Fair or a museum. Walt had the ideal collaborators to help bring his vision to reality. They were men who had created the appearance of motion pictures. Dick Irvine, Harper Goff, Bill Martin, Bud Washoe, Herb Ryman, Marvin Davis. They knew from long experience as art directors how to make sets pleasing to the eye, how to heighten drama by use of perspective and color. They had been accustomed to satisfying the desires of producers and directors, no matter how impractical they were. The average architect might not have been able to fulfill the wishes of Walt Disney. Walt wanted Main Street to be 5/8 scale, creating an era of nostalgic fantasy, but the stores along the street had to be practical ones where people could browse and shop. The art directors found the solution by making the ground floor 90% in scale, the second floor 80%, and the third floor 60%. The result was a charming illusion. There was one drawback in the use of studio art directors to plan Disneyland. They were accustomed to designing movie sets, which were normally used for only a few days, then dismantled. They had no expertise in planning buildings that would resist the onslaught of weather, aging, and millions of visitors. And so Walt brought in an expert in civil, electrical, and air conditioning engineering, Sam Hamill, and hired the firm of Wheeler and Gray to assist as structural engineers. Walt also needed a construction boss. He found him through C.V. Wood, the former head of Stanford Research Institute in Palo Alto, California, who had joined Disneyland as general director. Wood had been associated with Joseph Fowler, a consulting engineer and retired naval admiral. One April Saturday in 1954, Wood telephoned Fowler at his home in Los Gatos, near Palo Alto. "I'd like to bring a friend over to meet you," said Wood. He arrived with Walt Disney, who had come north to inspect the miniature railroad of a local hobbyist. "Look, Joe, I'd like to have you come down and get the feel of Disneyland," Walt remarked. Later, Fowler told his wife, "Hell, I don't know anything about the motion picture business, but I've got an invitation from the head of a studio, so I'll go down and stay a day or two." When he arrived at the studio, a secretary assigned him to an office, gave him keys to a car, and said, "We'd like you to talk to some contractors." It was 3 weeks before he returned home. He ended up supervising construction of Disneyland and managing the park for 10 years. Excavation for Disneyland began in August 1954, with the opening less than 11 months away. The first steps in preparing the property was removal of the orange trees. Morgan Bill Evans, whom Walt had hired to landscape Disneyland, had chosen trees he wanted to be spared and marked them by tying a colored rag around the trunks. Evans was upset to discover that the trees he selected had been removed with the others. It turned out that the man who operated the bulldozer was colorblind. The announcement that Walt Disney was entering television with a weekly show stirred a rumble of controversy in the film industry. Most of the major producers had observed a strict hands-off policy toward the new medium, reasoning that collaboration would cause further decline in theater business. Theater owners bolstered that policy with threats to boycott the product of any studio that releases movies and television. Walt Disney expounded in an interview his reasonings for entering television. "I've always had this confidence since way back when we had our first upsets and lost Oswald and went to Mickey Mouse. Then and there, I decided that in every way we could, we would build ourselves with the public and keep faith with the public. We felt that the public were really the people who had to play to, you know. We don't care about anybody in between. Once I was trying to sell Mickey Mouse, a fellow told me something. He said, 'Mickey Mouse? What is it? Nobody knows it. Why, I can get cartoons that I know for the same amount of money. You're asking.' Then he held up a package of Lifesavers. He said, 'Now, if you're inclined to sell me Lifesavers, they don't know you. And they don't know, that would be different because the public knows Lifesavers. They don't know you, and they don't know your mouse.' That hit me. I said, 'From now on, you're going to know. If they like a picture, they're going to know who made it. They're going to know what his name is.' And I struck Mickey Mouse so darn big on that title that they couldn't think it was a rabbit or anything else. The public had been my friend. The public discovered Mickey Mouse before the critics and before the theatrical people. It was only after the public discovered it that the theatrical people became interested in it. Up to that time, the critics wouldn't be bothered to give it any space, you see? So it all boils down that the newspapers and the people who write the newspapers are only interested in things after the public is interested, or if they think they can create some interest on the part of the public. So in all of your exploitations, everything from then on, we kept directly at the public. I never went to motion picture fan magazines. I said, nope, that is not the public. That's a segment of the motion picture audience, but not the whole motion picture audience. I always wanted to go for the big periodicals. I told my publicity boys, look, when you get the big magazines, then you're reaching a broader segment of the audience. Now when television came, I said, there's a way we can get to the public. Television is going to be my way of going direct to the public, bypassing the others who can sit there and be the judge on the bench. Maybe they never see any more of the public than those in their offices or those they see in the cocktail hour. In other words, the word is that's small to them. I decided when we get to television, we would have to control it. Now everybody wanted to buy our old product. We wouldn't sell it. We wouldn't hear of it. We wanted to handle it ourselves. Make good use of it. Some of the old product that should not be shown, we should not show. Some of it we should frame so it would have a proper presentation for today. We won't throw any piece of junk at the public and try to sell them. We fight for quality, and what we're trying to do through television is to let them know what we've done. And if they're interested in what we do, they'll come to the theaters to see it. There's a loyalty there. And 2 of the early television shows, Walt demonstrated his aim of acquainting the public with what his organization was doing. The series opened on October 27, 1954 with The Disneyland Story, which described coming attractions in both the Disneyland television show and the park itself. 2 other progress reports on the park appeared during the first television season. On December 8th, Disneyland presented Operation Undersea, a documentary about the filming of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. The show was accused of being a long trailer to publicize the movie, as indeed it was, but Operation Undersea proved entertaining enough to win the Television Academy's Emmy as Best Show of the Year. Walt gave liberally of the studio's backlog of films to television in the first season, showing Alice in Wonderland, Seal Island, So Dear to My Heart, Treasure Island, Wind in the Willows, and Nature's Half Acre, as well as several of the short cartoons. He also presented original shows, all of which far exceeded the $100,000 budget. One of the most expensive was Man in Space, a prophetic view of space exploration which had been prepared with technical advice from Wiley Ley, Hans Haber, and Werner von Braun. The television shows were introduced by Walt Disney himself. He agreed to appear after the network and advertising executives convinced him his presence was necessary to provide continuity and identification. He admitted to being scared to death when he had to face the camera, and he found fault with his performance, especially his voice. "It cracks," he complained in an interview. "I have a little laryngitis because I smoke too much, and I talk too much. All day long, I'm talking in meetings and wherever I go. I have a nasal twang, a Missouri twang. In my diction, I get sloppy, and I say, now we're gonna present something or other. Everybody says, that's fine, Walt, perfect. But the little script girl says, yes, but you said gonna instead of going to. So I gotta do it over because children are looking. You can't have sloppy habits." He grumbled over his dialogue and refused to talk about himself or praise his own product. His chief writer, Jack Spears, a radio writer who came to the studio in 1952 and developed the knack of writing natural dialogue for Walt, sometimes misjudged Walt's desires. The writer provided a glowing introduction to a film that Walt recognized as one of the studio's lesser efforts. "It's a good idea to sell the picture," Walt told Spears, "but I won't lie about it." Walt's inability to lie extended to the television commercials, which he agreed to deliver on rare occasions. He would talk about the sponsor's product only if he believed in it, and he did a commercial about an Eastman camera which he himself had found useful. But when the Eastman company brought out newer models, he declined to extol them on television. "I like the old one," he insisted. The hit on the first Disneyland season was Davy Crockett. Walt had been contemplating a series of television shows on legendary American heroes: Johnny Appleseed, Daniel Boone, Mike Fink, Bigfoot Wallace, Davy Crockett, and others. The first one concerned Crockett, and Bill Walsh prepared storyboards for the writer Tom Blackburn. Walt liked the saga, which took Crockett from the frontier to Congress and finally to the Alamo. An outside actor named James Arness was recommended to play Crockett, and Walt ran a science fiction film in which he starred them. "That's gay Davy Crockett," Walt exclaimed, pointing not at Arness but another giant in the film, Thess Parker. He was hired, taught to ride a horse, and sent off to film Davy Crockett in North Carolina. Davy Crockett was designed to occupy 3-hour-long shows on Disneyland, but when the film was assembled, it fell short of the length. Walt first tried spacing out the gaps with sketches, but that proved ineffective. One morning, Walt visited the office of George Bruns, a new composer at the studio, and mentioned the problem of bridging from one adventure to another. "George, can you get a little throwaway melody under the narration some way?" Walt asked. In half an hour, Bruns had composed a song that fit lines from Tom Blackburn's script. "Born on a mountaintop in Tennessee." When Walt dropped up by Bruns' office the next morning, the composer sang it for him. "I can't tell much from your singing," Walt said, "but it sounds okay. Bring in a small group and make a demo." Tom Blackburn added more words to the song, and Bruns made a demonstration record. Walt approved it, and the song was played and sung throughout the 3 segments. The demand for the Ballad of Davy Crockett began when a small part of it was heard in the preview portion of the first Disneyland show. After Davy Crockett Indian Fighter appeared on the ABC network on December 5th, 1954, the avalanche began. The song was number 1 on the hit parade for 13 weeks, and 10 million records were sold. Fess Barker became a star, and Buddy Ebsen, who played Davy's sidekick, George Russell, gained a new career. When the Disneyland television show was in the planning stages, the Disney merchandising department licensed manufacturers to issue products with the Frontierland imprint, presuming that Davy Crockett films would be merely a transitionary feature of the television series. However, Phil Samuth of Disney Merchandise believed that Crockett might inspire sales of coonskin hats, and he made inquiries into the industry. The results were discouraging. The fur hat industry in America had almost disappeared. The biggest manufacturer, a Chicago firm, had stopped making fur hats after suffering a $200,000 loss on them. The only market for raccoon skins was Red China, and because of the trade embargo, a California warehouse had been filled with undeliverable skins. After much persuasion and a 50% cut in the usual merchandising payment to Disney of $5,000, to which was added 5% royalty on gross sales, a firm named Welded Plastics agreed to become licensee for Davy Crockett coonskin hats. Samuth found a veteran fur cutter to oversee production of the hats. The Crockett television shows brought an unprecedented demand for furry headgear. Manufacturers, Disney licensed and otherwise, worked around the clock to produce hats. The wholesale price for skins jumped from 50 cents a dozen to $5. Their warehouse in California emptied, and when raccoon skins disappeared, hat makers used anything from Australian rabbit to mink. More than 10 million Davy Crockett hats were sold. The Disney merchandising division quickly recovered from the surprise of the Davy Crockett boom. A new member of the Disney organization, Vincent Jeffords, sent telegrams to major department stores warning they would be liable for damages if they sold unauthorized merchandise. It was a bluff, but it gave Disney time to enfranchise manufacturers for products bearing the title Walt Disney's Davy Crockett and a picture of Fess Barker. Jeffords dispatched posters of Parker with rifle and frontier outfit to stores everywhere. Costumes, coloring books, toys of every kind, most of them bearing the Disney imprint, sold by the millions. It was the greatest merchandising sweep for any national craze. Before or after, Disney offices in New York were so besieged by offers from hopeful licensees that the telephones had to be shut off for a time. One of the most popular items was a wooden Davy Crockett rifle, and the Disney merchandisers suggested a Davy Crockett Colt 45. Absolutely not, Walt declared. They didn't have Colt pistols in Crockett's time. He paid little attention to merchandising, but he insisted on 2 things. All articles must be authentic to the period, and products had to be of good quality. Walt had spent $700,000 on the Crockett films, even though he was assured of only $300,000 in revenue from television. The gamble paid off in other ways besides merchandising. Walt had an important star in Fess Parker. The 3 segments of Davy Crockett consolidated Disneyland as the most popular show in television, and merchandising provided substantial income. The Walt Disney Music Company, which had been formed in 1949 for sheet music sales, thrived for the first time. The success of Davy Crockett led to formation of another subsidiary for phonograph records. Then the Davy Crockett films were spliced together and released in theaters. To charge money for an attraction that had already been seen free by 90 million people was inconceivable, yet Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier, earned a theatrical profit of almost $2.5 million. Diane Disney met Ronald Miller on a blind date during a football weekend in San Francisco. He was a handsome, towering, powerfully built football end for the University of Southern California, and his roommate arranged the meeting after the Stanford University game. Ron and Diane began dating on the USC campus, and Diane took him home to meet her parents at the family Christmas party. The dates developed into romance, and Diane and Ron talked casually about marriage. Both Walt and Lily were impressed by Ron. They had expressed little regard for the boys Diane had brought home before. One evening, as she was about to join Ron in his car, Walt remarked, "You know, Di, we like this fellow Ron." Her mother added, "Yes, if you want to marry him, it's all right with us." Diane was flabbergasted. Her father had always told her and Sharon that they should wait until they were 25 before getting married. Diane was 20. When she related to Ron what her parents had said, he was as startled as she was. When Diane arrived home later that evening, she told her parents, "He thinks it's a good idea, too." Both Diane and Ron preferred a small wedding with close relatives and a few friends attending. So did Walt, but he also wanted the ceremony of a church wedding for his firstborn. Diane and Ron picked the date, May 9, 1954, and the setting, a small Episcopal church in Santa Barbara. They were baptized in the church the week before, and Walt and Lily as their witnesses. Sharon came home from the University of Arizona to be her sister's maid of honor. Walt led Diane down the aisle, then stepped back as the ceremony began. As the minister intoned the ritual, Diane heard a little sob. She turned around and saw her father with tears rolling down his cheeks. She gave his hand a squeeze, and he looked at her soulfully. "Who gives this woman to be married?" the minister asked. "Her mother and I do," Walt replied falteringly. He recovered his composure at the wedding reception, held at the Santa Barbara Biltmore Hotel. While posing for photographs, he stood on his tiptoes in an effort to shorten the gap between himself and his new 6'5" tall son-in-law. The wedding cake had the Disney touch, the two figures on the top depicting Diane in Levi's, Ron in Bermuda shorts, and a bare feet with a football helmet. Ron was expected to be drafted, and he dropped out of the university to go to work for his father-in-law, as liaison between WED and Disneyland. He was inducted in October and left for basic training at Fort Ord near California's Monterey Bay area. Diane, who was expecting their first child, lived in Pacific Grove near the camp. The baby arrived in the spring and was named Christopher Disney Miller. Walt was delighted to have a son in the family at last, although he was privately disappointed that Ron and Diane hadn't named the boy Walt. Thank you very much for your time today. As always, your time is important to me, and that you shared it with me is very special. Remember, today's special moments make tomorrow's memories. Have a good day.